Alright, today is going to be a weird one. This is due in no small part to my recent tussle with a couple of viruses and one of the results of tussling with them. And we're going to talk about drugs, and we're going to talk about other worlds, and we're going to mess around with something that's part of my tabletop hobby, but may not be part of yours. But hey, it's still miniature. So, maybe grab a drink and a snack, because we're going hard into the alchemy for this one. Greetings, good humans, and welcome to Tabletop Alchemy, where sometimes your host goes off the deep end and dares you to come along with him, and where we thank our patrons for indulging the alchemist in the room. Alright, I guess I should put a warning up front for this one. I want to talk about psychedelics, and I'm not promoting the use of any narcotics, prescription or otherwise, but I've got a secondhand story that has fascinated me from the first time I heard it. And typically the fourth Thursday of the month is a crafting or painting video. So here's my take on that for this month. This is Stud.io or stud.io. It's a 3D virtual Lego building software that you can download from bricklink.com. Now, some of you know I'm into Lego, otherwise known as, certified AFOL. You can look that up. And when I got sick for half of December and half of January, I kind of got back into it because I couldn't think or be energetic enough to get my personal creative projects done. It was just super nice and relaxing to build something, or in my case, quite a few somethings, from instructions and provided materials. And I just love how Lego builds magically grow from a pile of disparate pieces into something recognizable, from chaos to order right before your eyes. Very satisfying. Now, I've never really used Studio or Stud.io. I guess we just call it Studio, right? I've never really used Studio before, and something I'm really curious about is how it handles creating instructions. But to test that, we need a build, so I thought I would just mock up my little mushroom mock and use that to test out the whole program. Now, to prep this, I did figure out how to set up a separate project-based parts list, so I've already added most of the parts included in my little mock for easy brick selection. Now, while I work on that, let me tell you a story. A few years ago, my friend Brian, I don't think he'll mind me using his first name, I don't think, he did something he'd always wanted to do, and the day after, he told me all about it, because I was super interested in what this experience was like, especially from someone I knew really well. So, he had met a friend at the place he was working at who knew how to distill or refine DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine. And DMT is found in trace amounts in almost like every living thing on the planet, be it plant or animal, including in our own brains. Now, Brian had wanted to try a DMT trip, and to be perfectly frank, I've been very curious about that myself. I haven't yet, but who knows? I'm only getting older. DMT is essentially the train ticket ingredient found in ayahuasca. But taking it in the form of ayahuasca is like an all-day event, and the trip takes hours, and from what I understand, you can get, kind of physically your stomach can get upset, and you need somebody to shepherd you through, all this kind of stuff, right? Now, taking distilled or refined DMT results in a trip that lasts for 5 to 10 minutes, and then you're back. And from what I gather, once the trip is over, there's no real lingering effects. No hangover, no nausea, you're physically fine and operational. Mentally, you've just got this crazy experience to mull over for a few days. So, Brian sets up a date with his buddy to go on this trip. And his buddy has quite a bit of experience with DMT and is going to shepherd him through it from start to finish. And Brian's brother is also attending as another voyager, but also as a chaperone during the trip. I mean, if you're going to go out of your mind for a minute, it's nice to have people around you to sort of make sure you stay safe. So, this guy fills a pipe with whatever the appropriate amount of DMT powder is and helps Brian smoke it. Now, this process right at the start has its own protocol. You need to take nice, solid, big hits off of this pipe, and you have to take 3 hits in a row. The whole point of this is that DMT starts acting very quickly in the human brain, but it's also dosage dependent. The length or the volume or the how far your trip goes or how far you get launched is dosage dependent. The term breaking through to the other side is used a lot. If you don't imbibe enough, you don't really get the full experience. Okay, so Brian, a typical cannabis user, takes 3 really big hits off this pipe. And he said that even after the first hit, he started to mentally start his trip, and his buddy had to really help him get the next 2 hits off the pipe achieved. So now, there's a definite caveat here with Brian's story, which most people who try to describe their psychedelic trips will invoke. And Brian was no different when relating his story to me. Essentially, he's going to try to describe what he saw and experienced, but that he really doesn't have the words to express truly what he was seeing and feeling, because the experience is so beyond or above or past the primitive level of vocabulary, I guess is one way to put it, right? A lot of things people experience when they're on a psychedelic trip, they can't really put into words because the psychedelic nature of it is sort of beyond words. Does that make sense? Anyway, back to the trip, right? So Brian's train is leaving the station. He's like zooming out of this reality from his perspective. And he arrives in what he describes as a sort of hallway, maybe like being inside of a kaleidoscope. He gets the feeling of being in a hallway, even though maybe visually it isn't super defined that way, but he's seeing all kinds of shifting patterns and colors and textures, but he just has this feeling that he's in a hallway. And a being, this is where we're going to get, this is where we're going off the rails, man. This is what I find super interesting. And a being, meaning an entity, an autonomous living thing, comes down the hall to greet him. And the best way he could describe it was like a sort of silhouette made up of moving geometric stained glass patterns that kept folding and collapsing in on itself over and over. And this being, which there is a common term for these entities, and they're called in the broader public colloquialism as machine elves. This machine elf is talking to Brian, or communicating rather, without words. It's like he said he knew what the machine elf was communicating, but it definitely wasn't talking or using verbal language like English or something. And the machine elf was greeting him and was happy to see him and was expressing this like welcoming happiness of like, hey, we're glad you're here. Welcome, welcome. You know, this sort of vibe he's getting from this entity. Okay, time out. I know this sounds like I'm just going to relate this story and it's for fun or whatever, but there's a very real kind of mind-boggling statistic or fact or property of these stories. There's this one thing that brings up some genuine scientific questions that are super fascinating to me, and I'm looking forward to what you guys might make of it. Okay, so Brian is in the geometric kaleidoscopic hallway, and the machine elf wants Brian to follow him, and it takes him to a doorway. Again, the literal word doorway is only how he can describe it in verbal language. It's not exactly what he sees or experiences, but it's the best facsimile he has to describe it. And they go through this doorway and enter this really large room, and it's full of machine elves and strange machinery even. He said there were like hundreds of entities in this room, and some were working with this weird machinery, and a lot of them were maybe partying, and maybe I'm getting some of these details wrong just from the passage of time since he told me about this, but he said it was pretty overwhelming. But again, it was like he could hear them communicating ideas of welcome, and we're happy to see you, and it's great you're here. But overall, this room and all of this activity was maybe a little much for him to sort of take in all at once. So the machine elf that greeted him takes him back into the hallway, and they now move down the hallway. They're moving away from that first doorway, and it takes him to another doorway and sort of bids him to enter that doorway. So Brian goes into another space, and this one he describes as being like a super vast, like the ceiling is way, way, way up, and the room is just enormous. And in this room is another entity, another being, but it isn't a machine elf. This thing is gigantic, and he said it's really hard to describe, but it was kind of like a giant tiki mask. I know this is totally bizarre, to talk about. But anyway, he said it's like this psychedelic fractalizing tiki mask that's sort of floating there, and it's like 40 stories tall. And Brian said he'd never felt so small next to another living entity. He says this big dude didn't really talk to him or hardly even acknowledge his presence, but that he was sure that it was aware that he was there. And there was nothing malicious about it, but it was just kind of ambivalent about him being there. And I think Brian said that he just stood in this room with this gigantic entity looming over him for quite a while and didn't really feel afraid, but understood that this entity could crush him or remove him from reality in the blink of an eye. Just kind of what maybe, the POV of an ant standing next to a human being might be like, where, the human being could look down and be like, oh, there's an ant there, and the human being's having a good day and it's just, cool, we'll let the ant go about his business. Or a human being might just accidentally not notice the ant and step on it and remove it from existence. So, Brian was just experiencing these feelings and just hanging out in the room and just really sort of, it's interesting that he was able to sort of process ideas while he was in this sort of tripping out state, right? But he did say he was in that room just contemplating the sheer size and enormity of this other intelligence or this other entity that was in the room with him. And I forget if he said that the entity looked at him or not. I think he did say that initially the giant dude kind of looked down at him once, but that it never really communicated with him like the machine elf did. And then finally the machine elf eventually led him back out of the room into the hallway and back towards the way they'd come. And then Brian's trip was ending and he returned to our reality, and his trip came to an end. The train came back into the station. And that whole trip, he said, took between 5 and 10 minutes. Now, Brian is a proud atheist. And one of my first questions for him was, so did this experience affect his atheism in any way? Because both Brian and I were very curious about whether this experience was all internal, meaning generated by his own brain, or if he really met autonomous entities, right? And his answer to that was that this was the absolutely most poignant experience he'd ever had in any way that could possibly sway his atheistic opinion. That was pretty surprising to me. Now, here's the thing that trips me out the most. So after Brian goes on his trip, he's telling his buddy about it, and his buddy says, oh, you met so-and-so. And Brian's like, what? And it turns out there's an entire database online where people who go on these psychedelic journeys, kind of specifically this DMT trip, which seems to take people to a common location. There's this database where people record what they saw and what entities they've met. And Brian found the description of the giant tiki head dude, and there's a name for that entity. And many people have encountered that same entity. And there's a whole bunch of entities that have been recorded and cross-referenced by psychonauts. I really like that word, psychonaut. And this is what fascinates me to no end. There are now university research teams trying to map the DMT world, this location that people go to when they're tripping out on this drug. And it's this fact that disparate people going on these trips are all seeing the same entities and describing them the same way, independent of each other. So what is going on here? Is there actually another space, another dimension, another location that you literally go to when you trip on dimethyltryptamine, if I say that right? And if so, well, what the hell does that mean for science and our universe and our reality? It's such an intriguing concept. I mean, it's like literal science fiction, but for real. But then again, people aren't sure. But it's like the question is, how do all these different humans who go on these trips describe the same things when they haven't communicated to each other about what they're experiencing, right? I mean, nowadays, a lot of people will go to this database and read this stuff. So now we can kind of say, well, someone might be influenced, right? They already put the ideas in their head, and so they're going to generate this stuff on their own. But when the database was initially being built, and people were originally going there to describe their stories and their experiences, those people had not communicated with each other, or you know, sort of what's the term they use, you know, when cops separate people for interrogations, right? They hadn't. I'm old and my words are failing me. It happens more and more. Anyway, they hadn't colluded their stories yet, right? They hadn't got their stories cross-referenced. So that is very interesting to me. I would really like to go on a DMT trip. I'm a little bit afraid to, if I'm perfectly honest. But I would love to try it out before I leave this plane of existence. I worry that my own bad memories or feelings of nervousness or whatever could result in a bad trip, and that's the one thing that's sort of kept me from seeking out this experience myself. But nowadays there are entire programs that help people through the experience, where they guide you through some exercises and help you placate those inner fears and guide you and stay with you. You know, they're with you in the room, they do the whole setup so that you can have relatively high odds of having a good trip. And then to tie this all back to our little Lego build here, we've got lower tier psychedelics like magic mushrooms, proving to be extremely effective in psychiatry and psychology. Clinics are using psilocybin to treat PTSD and depression. You know, all these emotional and mental afflictions that typically would have been treated poorly, I might add, with synthetic pharmaceuticals. But also, non-psychedelic mushrooms are a fantastic food to cook up. Anyway, let's see what this studio does with the instructions thing, because that's what I've been looking forward to trying out. I have a parts list for this MOC on Bricklink, so theoretically you could order the parts and build this yourself if you wanted to, if I can figure out how to get a link to the parts list. So one thing I want to point out here is I built this MOC, I guess, around 10 years ago. In that time, Lego has introduced quite a few new excellent foliage parts and other new bricks that would be super cool to introduce into this type of model. So this instruction builder is actually pretty cool. It's definitely got its own learning curve here. Like, I don't understand why the build is being illustrated from what I would call the back of the model, but it looks like I'll have to go into each instructional step and turn the model around. Tedious, but doable. I think creating instructions might take as long as building the whole thing, but it's pretty cool how professional the pages look. You could make something that mimics actual Lego instructions fairly easily. That's pretty awesome. And of course, the site that houses this software, Bricklink, is actually owned by Lego, so maybe that's not a surprise there. And check this button out. Let's see what a render does. This should be interesting. Let's go with high resolution, and changing the light direction doesn't seem to update in the thumbnail or live view, so I'll just have to run a render and see what it does. For this little build, it shouldn't take too long, but I bet it would take quite a few minutes if you had a much bigger model in here. So that is pretty cool. Check that out. I don't know why the tan mushroom dishes don't have the mushroom texture pattern like the red one, but you know, I'm just gonna have to explore this more. This is literally my first time using the software, so you know, I'll check it out more in the future. It's pretty neat looking though, this render. It's pretty realistic. I'm very surprised. I mean, building in 3D like this doesn't hold a candle to working with actual Lego, but this is pretty cool nonetheless. Man, there are just so many ways to express your creativity these days. It's kind of astounding. So many things to get into and explore and geek out on. Well, I don't know, if you're into Lego, maybe check out this studio software, and if you're not into Lego, what are you doing? Get on the train, man. Alright, yell at me about Lego, or how I'm diluting the tabletop hobby content on this channel, or your thoughts on psychically accessing new dimensions, and going on virtual trips to places unseen and on the other side of the rain.
Wherever magicians used to go, perhaps. On the other side of the rain.
See ya.